Hi, and welcome to chapter 4 of The Power of Babel by John McWhorter. And this chapter is titled Some Languages Are Crushed to Powder but Rise Again as New Ones. All right. So, in general, Westerners, in this case English speakers, rarely find themselves in situations where they have to adapt their spoken tongue, right, to suit a situation. Because of cultural dominance, for better or worse, and economic advantages, many people who can afford it are learning English across the globe. While the opposite is just not true, right? Few English speakers have the incentive to struggle, to learn a new language. In many parts of the world, however, merely venturing outside one's village means exposing oneself to an unfamiliar tongue. These languages often have no books, no dictionaries, but are instead learned on the fly. According to McWhorter, and I quote, most languages are not written. Thus, one acquires them not to have access to a literature or to learn about the culture, his quote, but for the utilitarian purpose of interacting with their speakers for reasons tied to basic sustenance through the exchange of goods and services. Page 132. So, in other words, for most people, learning the language is a practical endeavor, right? Okay, one example of this comes from the 1800s. The example he gives here is when Russian and Norwegian traders had to make do with the minimum communication to get by. The result, I'm pronouncing this right, Russenorsk, right? A blend of the two languages, Russian and Norwegian, which is not a mixed language or any type of language for that matter. Its vocabulary was limited to just a few hundred words, and its grammar was as rudimentary as can be. As McWhorter puts it, I quote, this kind of rudimentary but functional way of communicating is called a pidgin. And pidgins have always formed throughout the world when people needed to use a language on a regular basis without having the need or motivation to acquire it fully. Page 134. So in the case of Russenorsk, both groups were about equal in power, and subsequently the words in this pidgin, were about evenly split between Russian and Norwegian. However, this is not typically the case. What often happens when a pidgin emerges between two or more groups is that the words in the language of the dominant group are used. Such was the case, for instance, between Native Americans and encroaching Europeans, right? It was the Native Americans who had to do most of the difficult work, right? The linguistic work. So pidgins then are makeshift tools of communication, right? They only serve practical and not to mention limited purposes. I quote here, the crucial thing about pidgins, as McWhorter said, is that their speakers are using them mostly as transitory tools for passing exchanges. Page 137. So by no means do they substitute for or undermine the native tongue of either party. That having been said, on occasion, pidgins have become the primary or even the only means of communication. And I quote, in certain unusual situations, humans have been forced to use pidgins not as make-do lingos, but as primary languages in their lives, sometimes the only one. Page 138. This mostly occurred during European colonization, so between 1400s and 1800s, when so-called masters and slaves needed to communicate just what was necessary. All pidgins are derived from a full language or languages, so when humans are compelled to evolve a pidgin in order to make it more flexible or more precise, that resulting evolution is called a creole. Okay? And as I've mentioned before in previous chapters, no, there is no consensus among linguists, right? Where does a pidgin end? When does a creole begin? Okay, you ask different linguists, you're going to get different answers, right? Remember, we have these for convenience, okay, but they don't show the whole truth. And Anyway, the spread of a pidgin often happens in places like Papua New Guinea, right? A relatively small area where 800 or so languages are spoken today. So, an accessible pidgin allows the different speakers to communicate at least on a basic level. But because it is, because it's rudimentary, a pidgin, as mentioned, evolves into something else when tasked to play a larger role in communication, right? This evolution culminates into an actual language called the Creole language. In the case of Papua New Guinea, this Creole, still in use today, is called Tok Pisin. Again, don't quote me on the pronunciation of that. Could be Tok Pisin, Tok Pisin. I hope it's not Pisin. That's just a bit vulgar. Anyway, so unlike the pidgin it sprang from, Tok Pisin has the ability to express advanced grammatical features such as plurality, tenses, right? All of these things are usually absent from a pidgin. Like all fully fledged languages, it is undergoing change, right? With differences now between rural Tok Pisin and Tok Pisin spoken in the cities, right? So it's, what's happening to it is what happens to any language, right? It undergoes change. That's why there's no such thing as a language, right? Because it's always changing. Excuse me. So Creoles, therefore, and I quote, in regard to taxonomy, are definitely distinct languages, okay, from the ones from which they take their words. Page 145. So a Creole is not merely a non-standard dialect of a language, right? Like say Bavarian German versus Standard German. A French person speaking Standard Parisian French can, to a reasonable extent, understand a French Canadian, but neither of them can understand the Creole French of Martinique, right? So where exactly does a pidgin and a Creole begin? Yeah, I've mentioned this. You guessed it. There's no consensus, right, among linguists. And so determining how many Creoles are in the world is a subjective question, right? Some people consider certain Creoles fully fledged languages. Some people can still consider them pidgins. So there's really no answer to that question. How many Creoles are there in the world? Anyway, note that English is not the only language to have been creolized. Yeah, French and Portuguese especially have many Creole descendants. However, some Creoles are not based on European languages. There's an Arabic pidgin, for example, as well as a short-lived one based on the Chinook language in North America. Good stuff. All right. Note that, and I quote here, a Creole is a type of language, not the name of just one. It seems there's a common misconception here. Page 149. Okay, so a Creole is a type of language, not the name of just one. This misconception is not the only one to exist. According to the author, another quote, sometimes the status of a language as a Creole, a true language, rather than a pidgin, a broken version of another language, is obscured by the typical lack of fit between folk and linguists' usage of the word pidgin. Page 151. So, for instance, in Hawaii, a language called pidgin, with a capital P, is actually a Creole. Okay? So there's some confusion between, trained linguists and everyday people who use these words. A similar situation exists in Africa, where a Creole called Creole is often labeled a pidgin. So, there you have it. So, how exactly do people transform, so to speak, a pidgin into a Creole? In the words of the author, quote, how do they know what structures to add, what words to refit to express aspects of the grammar necessary to a full human language? Page 152. The short answer is people use their native language as a basis, the language they had spoken before the introduction of the pidgin. They model the new words based on the grammar and sound patterns of their original tongue. This brings us to an important question about distinction. What is the difference between an intertwined language, right, which we've talked about before, and a Creole, right? Recall that an intertwined language often results when a group feels more or less equal allegiance to two cultures, two entities, like French and Cree, the example I mentioned in chapter 3. Okay, both of these languages are fully developed ones. The roots of a Creole on the other hand, spring from a pidgin, which is a watered down, broken language whose sole existence was at some point just basic communication, right? So that's the difference. Another difference has to do with the speakers themselves. Here's what I mean. So when two languages mix, the speakers of both languages speak in a manner that is mutually intelligible to their compatriots, right? So to take the French Cree example, all French speakers understand each other, right? As do all Cree speakers. That is why in this case, it's a language mixing and not a Creole. In the case of Creoles, the places where they spread consisted of people from either varied tribes or different races altogether, right? Hawaii, for instance, at some point comprised Chinese, Japanese, and other peoples, right? In addition to the natives. So there was no way to reconcile the vast linguistic chasm that resulted. And so a Creole became necessary, right? A Creole then is not a mixture between two languages, although more than two languages can intertwine, but a compromise, right, between vastly different languages. Often, what was the greatest common denominator between all the languages at hand became the accepted one. Okay? Yeah. So, next point. This flexibility also meant that a Creole is free to borrow from the languages of the usually colonizers, right? So this makes Creoles leave interesting footprints, for lack of a better word. Recall that this process had taken place starting in the 1400s, right, before Shakespeare was born. And so Creoles that survive today retain the structures and sometimes words of extant languages that were in use during colonial times, but not necessarily today, right? Also, most Europeans who left Europe to carve out a new life were usually not the wealthy members of their society, right? Those that usually spoke the standard dialect. So, most lived before the time of nationalism, before countries were unified. Therefore, even though I've been calling these languages, Portuguese, French, and so on, this is a bit of a misnomer. What these earlier Europeans typically spoke was a non-standard dialect of Portuguese, a regional form of French, etc. Right? I mean, think about it, if you were living comfortably in Paris, right, or Berlin, or Lisbon, chances are you would not travel, across the Atlantic and take that dangerous route and, not see your family for years. Right? Just to make a good life. If you had a good life, you probably stayed there, right? So usually those that went, to colonize spoke a non-standard variety, right? And those sort of survive sometimes through the Creoles. And I quote here, a Creole, recorder states, often serves as an interesting window on its host language's past, as well as its range of dialectical variety. Page 157. All right. So, in addition to its native tongue and the language of the colonizer, a Creole had another option when branching away from its mother pidgin. There is, for lack of a better term, a natural grammar, right? Or a natural tendency toward one. This may sound English-centric, but for the most part, Creoles have demonstrated the typical English sentences construction of subject, verb, object, right? Order of a sentence, Yeah. So, usually we need to know first who or what are we talking about, right? Followed by what they're doing. And ending with who or what is affected by this, right? There seems to be a natural tendency toward this. Creoles, almost always follow this order, regardless of other factors, right? Such as the pidgin they came from, the languages they borrowed from, etc. Another natural tendency, and I use this term, cautiously, is for Creoles to place tense markers before the verb, right? English, for example, does so with the future, right? We put will before the infinitive, but not the past, where ed is a suffix, right? D and ed, they're added afterward. Same thing for the simple present, s and whatever, they're added afterward. So the author offers a cogent summary of all this. And I've quoted this rather lengthy summary here. Creoles, then, are mixed languages of a sort. However, more specifically, they combine pidginized elements from the creators and the dominant group's languages and then expand this into a true language. The expansion is accomplished largely through refashionings of features already in the pidgin, this directed in part by universal default constructions that older human languages have often drifted away from. Page 159. Okay. All right, we still have 4 major points. Okay, the following point has been repeated several times by me and is a central theme in McWhorter's book. Okay, drawing sharp, distinguishing lines across linguistic developments is, although useful, perhaps even necessary, ultimately futile, right? As it cannot capture the complexity and change that goes on in languages. As McWhorter claims, and I quote, like language change, the language dialect distinction and degrees of language mixture, the extent to which a language is pidginized before it becomes a full language again is a matter of degree rather than stark metrical distinctions. Page 159. Many situations can occur when it comes to pidgins and creoles. To illustrate, some slaves hated their masters or were kept away from them, preventing or retarding language acquisition. At other times, right, as a pidgin or creole was developing, the colonizers up and left for various reasons and took their language with them. So these and other situations make classifying some pidgins and creoles almost impossible. Should these half-baked, for if we can call them that, should these half-baked languages be considered creoles or dialects of another language? Again, no clear answers exist, right? This classification difficulty is somewhat addressed by calling these languages semi-creoles. So that term has emerged. A notable example of a semi-creole is Afrikaans in South Africa. A semi-creole, and I quote, is a language straddling the line between dialect of X and creole with words from X. Page 160. So think of a semi-creole as existing above in hierarchy to a creole but below a language. Classifications of this sort are undoubtedly imperfect, right? But they nonetheless offer a rough method of gauging where a language lies in terms of development or type. Okay. There's another tendency that has happened to some languages that is worth mentioning. When a language is spoken by adults as a secondary language, and if those adults are greater in number than those speaking that tongue as a first language, after a period of time, what happens is that the more arbitrary aspects of that language begin to die out. Okay, what happens essentially may be called a, quote, lightly pidginized language. Okay, and this is my term, so I didn't take it from the book. Okay, so a lightly pidginized language, where a language retains most of its features but receives a trim or a shave to its less accessible aspects, right? I quote McWhorter now, whose words are especially salient when it comes to the present status of English. When a language has a large number of both native and non-native speakers, the non-native variety often shows what the languages as a whole would look like if non-native speakers became a majority. Page 168. Okay, obviously this is the case of English. Plenty of native speakers, plenty of non-native speakers. One last thing to note on this point of blurred lines and gray areas. Creoles themselves can sometimes mix if the speakers of a certain Creole also happen to speak languages that are similar to each other, say like Portuguese and Spanish, right? What results from this is a mixture between intertwining and creolization, okay? So as you can see, linguists have, quite the challenge, right? It's tough. It's tough to agree, right? It's tough to agree more often than not. Anyway, Next point. All of what we've discussed so far brings us to this argument that there was once one original language thought to have existed at least 150,000 years ago, and from which different languages branched out as a result of everything we have talked about, right? Some speakers shaved something off of it, others only acquired basic grammatical structure before moving on to a new place. Still others who spoke slightly different varieties of this language met at some point, right, intermarried, and their distinct dialects became intertwined. Fast forward at least 150,000 years, and what we have today are the extant languages of the modern world. Not only dialects, but creoles themselves change and branch into dialects. They also mix with other languages and even become pidginized themselves. These pidgins, if the conditions are right, may be reworked into different creoles. The cycle set in motion all those millennia ago has little changed. Okay, last point. The 4 chapters discussed so far indicate that, again, there's no such thing as a language, right? If you read the book, you'll see that this point is hammered in. And it's a good argument, right? I mean, it's a plausible argument, let's put it that way. Languages simply never stand still long enough. People tend to say, for instance, that South Americans, with the exception of Brazil, speak Spanish, right, as I've mentioned before. But in truth, each region speaks a dialect of Spanish. The Spanish language is and will forever remain an ideal. And this is further complicated by the fact that Spanish is mixing with many local dialects at the same time. So chapter 4 can be summarized thus. And here's the author's words. With creoles, then, we have rounded out our perspective on human language as guided by certain ineluctable imperatives. Once it hits the ground, a human language must and will change, because change can proceed in various directions. Once a language is spoken by separate populations, it must and will diverge into dialects. Juxtaposed with other languages, human languages must and will mix. Torn down to its bare essentials, if needed as a medium of full communication, a human language must and will rise again as a new one. Page 176. And so ends chapter 4. I will see you in the next one, chapter 5.